Hello everyone, my name is Maxwell-Stevenson and today we are going to be doing a lesson on subjectivity and objectivity. And I hope you find it helpful and useful and I hope you enjoy it. So firstly, let's start off with our goals for today. So hopefully by the end of this lesson, you'll be able to understand and demonstrate that you understand the difference between subjectivity and objectivity. So this is our key aim once this lesson concludes. You're able to understand the difference between these two concepts. I also want you to be able to use examples of each concept correctly. And I'm also hoping that you'll be able to distinguish examples from non-examples of the concept. So not only will you be able to come up with your own examples of things which are subjective and things which are objective, but you'll also be able to demonstrate why certain things don't fit into certain categories. Okay, so let's get started. Let's start with subjectivity. So this will be our first concept. Here are 4 examples of phrases which are subjective. So that movie sucked. It's way too hot in here. Do as I say, not as I do. And this class is so hard are all examples of subjective statements. So I would like you to take a minute to think about what all of these 4 quite drastically different statements have in common. And I'd also like you to come up with your own. So I'm sure that you said some type of subjective statement today. So just take a minute to think about or write down, note down, type down a subjective statement which you've used recently. And when we get to our next slide, we'll go through the criteria for distinguishing whether or not something is a subjective claim, and you'll be able to see if you adequately identified a subjective statement of your own. Okay. So what do all of these things, these previous 4 statements which were mentioned on the last slide, and hopefully your own statement which you thought of, what do they all have in common? Well, firstly, they all vocalize statements which are a matter of opinion. So when I say the movie sucked, but my boyfriend who loves action films says that he loved the movie and it was the best film he's ever seen, neither of us is right and neither of us is wrong. We're merely vocalizing different opinions and different points of view. So consequently then, given that objective statements vocalize a matter of opinion, there is therefore room for disagreement. And there is room for disagreement because the claims being made are not factual. And because they're not factual, they can't be said to be right or wrong, and they therefore can't be proven or disproven. So take a little minute to reflect on whether or not the claim which you came up with was subjective. If it was, think about how you were able to adequately discover that it was. And if it wasn't, think about not only why it wasn't, but also how a claim such as that could be made into a claim that was subjective and could become a matter of opinion. So, for example, if I earlier had a claim which said something like, I really don't like Diet Coke, that is a subjective claim, right? But if I'd said Diet Coke is a soda, that doesn't look to be a matter of opinion anymore. It becomes a matter of opinion when I state my own opinion, and that is something where it's not factual, can't be proven or disproven, and allows for room for disagreement. Okay, so let's now turn to objectivity, which is essentially just the polar opposite of subjectivity. So here are 4 examples of statements which are objective. That film was 3 hours long. It is 32 degrees outside. My Diet Coke cost $1.75, and Iowa shares a border with Illinois. Hopefully you're able to notice how these statements are incredibly different from the previous statements we saw when we were discussing subjectivity. So I'd like you to take a moment to reflect on the ways in which these statements look different. And again, think of an objective statement which you've maybe used recently, similar to the four which are listed here. And when we proceed to the next slide, you'll be able to decipher whether or not you accurately were able to come up with an objective statement. Okay, so what did all of these objective statements have in common? Well, hopefully you were able to see that these claims were factual. They might not have been correct, but they could be proven or disproven. So if I say to you that my Diet Coke was $1.75 and you can see the receipt, it wouldn't really make any sense for you to say, no, it's not. It's my opinion that it didn't cost that. When I can show you that it clearly did, you would just be wrong. It's not my opinion, for example, that the movie was 3 hours long. It either was or it wasn't. And stating a fact about the duration of a film is a very different claim from stating my emotional response to a film, which, as we earlier saw, is a subjective claim, whereas the duration of the movie is an objective claim because it either was or wasn't 3 hours long. So with objective statements, they are factual, which therefore means that there's no room allowed for disagreement because they can be proven or disproven, and consequently objective statements are not a matter of opinion, right? They are a matter of fact. Put slightly differently, subjective statements allow for gray area, a lot of wiggle room and movement in terms of opinion, whereas with objective statements, they're very black and white. They're either right or they're wrong, and they can be shown to be such. So what are the implications of deciphering whether or not a statement is objective or subjective? Well, whilst it might seem straightforward to distinguish a subjective claim from an objective claim, this is not always the case. Especially in the branch of philosophy, philosophers spend a lot of time trying to decipher whether certain claims are subjective or objective, because of course, if a claim is subjective, it cannot be disproven or proven. So claims such as God exists, abortion is immoral, and killing is always wrong, as things stand currently in philosophy, have not been shown to be objective claims because there's good evidence on each side of the argument, right? Any claim that I've listed on this slide or a claim which speaks to the contrary, so for example, an individual who doesn't think that God exists, and an individual who is pro-choice versus pro-life, or someone, for example, who believes in euthanasia or capital punishment, are going to have good evidence on their side which can't be disproven. And therefore, in philosophy, this is very important to keep in mind, as often people who vocalize views such as these aren't aware that their claims are subjective, right? But instead think that they're vocalizing objective, factual claims, and therefore are unwilling to open their eyes to evidence which is contrary to the view which they're espousing. So what should we do now that we're in the knowledge that certain views which we hold, whether they be religious, whether they be moral views, indeed even if they're political views, what should we do knowing that our views are subjective as opposed to objective, when we may have previously thought that our views weren't a matter of opinion, but were just the right factual views? Well, firstly, it's important to be humble in our views, to be open to alternative viewpoints, and be willing to learn more information not only about the view which we find the most compelling, but also about contrary opinions, so we can be as best educated as we can be. We should also acknowledge that our views are subjective and therefore be willing um, to get into arguments and disagreements with people in a healthy and respectful manner, whilst we acknowledge that people are entitled to disagree with us. And we should also try, as I've mentioned, to be as educated as possible on our subjective views. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this was very helpful and that now you are able to distinguish subjective claims from objective claims. You're able to come up with your own examples of statements which fit into each category, as well as being able to identify when a claim isn't subjective or isn't objective and why that is the case. And I also hope that this video prompts you to reassess your own political, religious, moral beliefs, whatever the case may be, and to understand that it's very important to realize that as far as philosophy has been able to prove thus far, all of the beliefs that we hold very dear to our hearts are subjective, and therefore it's important to allow discussion with people with different views and alternative viewpoints on these matters so that we can become as educated and informed as possible. Thank you so much for listening.